And of course, I wanted to add my congratulations and thanks publicly for Commissioner McDowell's service at the FCC. Certainly his collegiality was wonderful while I was there, his statesmanship, and of course his friendship and his families over the years. I am very thrilled to note that over 50% of our panel today is female, in keeping with one of my other hats, and that is co-chair of the Healthy Media Commission, so I wanted to take note of that. As you all know, I'm an advocate for keeping girls and women in this sector and in STEM education overall, because not only for this sector, but for every other sector, I've been saying that females are our greatest natural resource to continue the expansion of ICTs worldwide. So in keeping with movie themes and the life of Pi this morning, we have been talking about quite a bit of reform of the FCC, and I think we'll continue to do that with regards to video and programming. Commissioner Pi has been out talking about the reforms quite a bit, and today he even brought up forbearance, applying that to Title VI, and I loved his bringing up even sua sponte forbearance. Very refreshing, I think, for all of us who have been in this world for a long time. But now we are going to kind of look backwards to the 1990s and discuss the MVP world and video regulation. The previous panel, of course, was all about wireline and wireless broadband. However, video is absolutely driving so much of this explosion across all platforms and indeed globally. So we need to get on with this show and hear from this panel. You all know, of course, Donna Gregg, the former Media Bureau Chief, now at Catholic University Law School, formerly at Wiley Run. I think I saw Chairman Wiley walk in. And so we really want to hear about her insights, both from her time at the Commission, but also philosophically now that she is a professor. Next, Gigi Sohn, you all know, who is President, CEO, and co-founder of Public Knowledge, and certainly a respected advocate and champion for the public's rights as well as individual citizens. Michael Powell, former chairman of the FCC and oversaw one of the most transformational times in history and coined the phrase that I often borrow from him. In fact, I remember making a phone call to say, can I please borrow your phrase, humble regulator? And he said, knock yourself out, Commissioner Tate. Stacy Fuller, vice president for DIRECTV, regulatory affairs, and advisor also to Commissioner Abernathy, and will give us satellite television perspective. Stephen Teplitz, now senior VP at Time Warner Cable, also formerly an FCC attorney, can give us the specific company's perspective on the recent FCC decisions, as well as some court decisions that have come out. And finally, Bill Lake, Chief of the Media Bureau, thank you so much, who's also leading auction strategy, if you all have any questions about the upcoming auctions, and certainly welcome your insights and perspective about the entire convergence and explosion of the video marketplace. So we are going to start with a few very brief opening comments now that our time has really dwindled somewhat. And so with that said, Donna, I'll let you open.
Thank you, Debbie, and thanks to Randy and the Free State Foundation. And I, too, would like to add my thanks and admiration for Commissioner Powell's service. That happened to be the time I overlapped with him at the Commission when I was Media Bureau Chief, and also with Commissioner Tate, and they were both absolutely great to work with and did great service for the country. I'm coming now, I'm doing a lot of Yogi Berra these days, because having been involved as a counsel to companies who are involved in video, and then being a regulator, sometimes of some of those same companies, I experienced regulation for media in one way, and now I have an opportunity to step back and think about what I experienced and saw before, and watch, learn a lot, observe, by just watching what's going on now. And I do have a few observations I'd like to share with you. We are living in an era now with the internet and the media of constant instant polling and rankings, top 10 lists. If you watch late night TV, you can have a top 10 list every night. If you look at your browser, you can get the top 10 best fashion trends for spring, or the 10 best restaurants that are ranked from anywhere from Barcelona to Minneapolis. And you can also get the rankings, which, if any of you are fans of men's and women's basketball, as I am, you anxiously turn the day that the AP poll and the coaches poll come out. So we're constantly confronted with that. But I have my own ranking list. And my own ranking list is not some of the best regulatory approaches that have been taken toward video. I'm going to be charitable and not say that this is my ranking of the worst, but I will say that these are on my list of questionable regulatory approaches that were not necessarily always successful. Before I reveal, and I'm not going to reveal all 10, I could do more than 10 as a matter of fact, but I'll just do 3 or 4. But each one of the regulatory approaches that I'm going to mention, each one of them has something in common with the others. First of all, I will say that I think all of them were adopted by the agency, by the FCC, or imposed by Congress with good intentions. They have that in common. In addition, unfortunately, a lot of them were very administratively burdensome for the regulated entities to deal with. Some had unfortunate, I think all had some unfortunate unintended consequences. There were even some that were completely baffling, annoying, and greatly disliked by the public. And I think that was probably one of the worst things at all, because the regulations were supposed to serve the public interest, but the public was not always, very enthusiastic about the way some of those regulations played out. Then finally, all of those regulatory approaches were predicated on circumstances, existence of a scarcity of, or a limitation of outlets for people, or for messages and information and communications to get to the audience. And also they were predicated on a lack of competition. Well, none of those common circumstances that were the underpinning for some of these regulatory schemes, it still exists today. We have many more outlets. People have a lot of different ways to tell their stories, to deliver information. People have a variety of ways to achieve it or to receive it. And also, there's a lot of competition. If you look at even the 14th annual video or competition report from the Commission, and you look at a lot of the other surveys that are being done, there truly is unprecedented amount of competition for delivery of video, much more than there ever has been. So here are my 4 questionable, ranked as questionable regulatory approaches. Must carry retransmission consent. Something adopted, I think, with good intentions, with high hopes. Touted as a market solution because it requires negotiation. But I submit that a negotiation is not necessarily a market negotiation if the government lays down the ground rules. Must carry and retransmission consent in tandem have caused a lot of, I think, outrage by the public, by viewers who are suddenly deprived a program of their channel or of programming that they want to watch, always right before the Academy Awards or the Super Bowl, or God forbid it would be the NCAA Final Four. Another questionable set of regulations, and I know there's someone here in the audience, Mr. Efros, this may ring true to him. The network non-duplication, and especially the syndicated exclusivity rules, resulted in more deprivation of certain channels or certain stations that for people, particularly those living on border areas between two television markets. The third one, commercial leased access. And of course, we had the little kerfuffle with the Office of Management and Budget. But those were regulations that certainly imposed difficult administrative burdens, and it just was a bad business model. It didn't really work. I actually, when I was in practice, had an opportunity to represent both cable companies who were dealing with wannabe channel lessees, and I even represented, not against each other, but I represented some people who wanted to lease channel time on cable systems. And I have to say that the more savvy people who wanted to use that and recognized that it wasn't a very good business model, because really the only viable application or the viable business that you could do using leased access was pretty much advertising and infomercials. So even the people that were using it more or less successfully for infomercials, the minute the internet took off, immediately realized that that was a much better platform for delivering that kind of communication. Also with video over the internet.
Quickly, Donna.
Okay.
Number 4.
And the fourth one was basically the 1992 rate regulation scheme in the 1992 Act, also administratively burdensome and couldn't really be handled by a lot of the municipalities who had to hire consultants or else forego regulating entirely. The last thing I wanted to say was that I found in my observations, I have found something that I think is very encouraging, and that is the introduction of the Next Generation Television Marketplace Act in the last Congress. That proposes an overhaul, possible elimination of some of the very regulatory approaches that I mentioned, as well as others. And
we're going to talk about that
good,
further in
good.
questions.
I just want to say that
That's
I
great.
hope that Mr. Scalise reintroduces that and that other members will support it.
Thanks, Donna. Gigi.
Good morning, and thank you, Debbie and Randy. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really do enjoy speaking at your conferences, although I did want to jump up on the podium at the last panel and speak, but I held myself back. So I'm not going to quote Yogi Berra. I'm going to quote somebody else and saying that for TV, it's the best of times and the worst of times. Programming is fantastic. It's great the way people are consuming TV over their iPads, even in their own homes through Wi-Fi, and life is good as far as program is concerned. But the problem is that everything's changed about TV except the Byzantine regulatory structure, and the result is really negative for consumers. So rather than the content provider just directly providing content to consumers, you have this, again, I'll use the word Byzantine because I think it fits, set of middlemen who are either protected by government fiat or, in some other cases, they have bottlenecks that really are not being enforced by antitrust regulators, and sometimes the law just doesn't fit. So really, in this equation, in my opinion, consumers are the losers. And let me give you some examples, and Donna mentioned some of them. First of all, consumers are held hostage by retrans fights and blackouts, almost always coming at the times when they want to watch the shows that they want to watch most. Second, they're unable to access local broadcast stations over their cable that may be more relevant to them than the ones that the cable operator is forced to carry. So that's the whole distance signal, syndicated exclusivity, sports blackout rule, all that nonsense, decades-old regulation. They're subject to ever higher cable rates, and in large part because of retrans fights and the bundling that large content creators engage in. Consumers are still using set-top boxes that have looked the same for 25 years, and they don't have a choice when it comes to devices to hook up to their cable systems and also access the internet. And finally, they're saddled with restrictive data caps that force them to make a decision as to what to watch and what not to watch. So as you can see, I'm, punching everybody. Nobody gets away from the concerns that we have. So you may have seen that Public Knowledge put out a paper, I guess maybe a year ago now. It's called Tomorrow Vision, and I really commend everybody to read it. It was written by my colleague, John Bergmeyer, who's a bright young attorney who just did a fantastic job. And it's got four suggestions, four recommendations for changing the regulatory structure to be more consumer-friendly. First is just reforming or, frankly, eliminating all the regulations that protect broadcasters. Now, I'd love to see retransmission consent repealed. I'm not sure that that's going to happen, but there are certainly reforms that can happen short of that, including requiring broadcast stations to stay on during a dispute. Consumers should not be the losers there. We believe, the FCC doesn't believe, that they can order arbitration, and I understand that there's some talk in Congress about possible legislation that will directly give them that authority, so there's no question. Certainly, distance signal protection, sports blackout, and must carry, those are from a bygone era and really need to be eliminated. They're nothing but, just incumbent protectionist schemes, so they really need to go. Second is the FCC should finish its rulemaking about what constitutes an MVPD, or multi-channel video provider, and should permit over-the-top or online video providers to take advantage of the advantages that MVPDs have. Now, I don't think they should apply all of Title VI to OVDs, and they need to decide what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. I don't think they should apply commercial leased access. And I'd have to think about whether I agree with you or not. Certainly, commercial leased access hasn't worked. I certainly would agree with you on that. So the FCC should finish up that proceeding and allow OVDs like Sky Angel to take advantage of the same rights and responsibilities that MVPDs do. Third, the FCC should make it illegal for MVPDs to act anti-competitively with regard to OVDs. So we specifically say that they should have a declaratory ruling that prohibits MVPDs from engaging in unfair methods of competition or deceptive acts and practices with regards to OVDs. Now, until OVDs are actually allowed to, operate like MVPDs is probably almost a moot question. So I think the FCC needs to decide that MVPD/OVD question first. Fourth, and finally, is to allow consumers to attach any non-harmful device to their cable systems. We liked the all-vid suggestion. That was in the National Broadband Plan. I'm sure my colleagues to my left will beat the living daylights out of it. But again, have you looked at your set-top box lately? It really hasn't changed in 25 years, and I think that's because there's not device competition. I think I'm going to ask John to update our paper to include something about bundling. We're watching the Cablevision Viacom case with great interest. I think while we wish Cablevision well, I'm skeptical. And I think we're skeptical that the antitrust laws are strong enough here to do anything about it. But it is a major problem. And again, that and rising retrans rates lead to the help to lead to the ever-growing cable rates. And it's very, very problematic. I don't know if folks saw in the Post article from a couple days ago where Verizon is now trying to figure out who watches what, and they're going to negotiate with the bundlers along those lines. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe Tom can explain how that actually works. But it's interesting to see the cable operators start to fight back against the bundling of channels that nobody really watches. So I'll close there.
Thank you, Gigi. Mr. Powell.
Thank you. I sit before you today as a proud member of Byzantium. I think that the cable architecture continues to be an extraordinary value for American consumers, and I hope we're able to get into that in terms of our questioning and our discussions. But what I would like to say is there's a certain truism about the regulatory state, which is it is only as valid as the factual predicates, the rationales that inform them continue to be viable and authentic. And it seems to me, unquestionably, we have a situation in which the world of video has changed not a little, but quite radically from the last time that our collective government made those judgments about how it should be regulated. I would be the first to admit, if we were to time travel back to 1992, you would be looking at the cable industry as a multi-video provider that absolutely was a monopolist. It had 98% of that market. And at the time, virtually every rule in the 1996 Act is built on one of three cornerstones, two of which are related to monopoly power, horizontal or vertical. Horizontally, there were few, if any, meaningful horizontal video competitors in the market. This is before DBS, this is before the internet, this is before telephone companies were able to enter in the video market. And many of the rules were intended to jumpstart and energize a horizontally competitive marketplace. Secondly, in 1992, over 50%, probably closer to 53, 57%, of cable programming was vertically integrated with a cable operator. Today, that number is radically lower, closer to only 14%. And the general trend over this period of time has been the disaggregation of content and distribution and not the reaggregation of it. Yet, the rules that are administered today are fundamentally built on the cornerstones of those judgments. And the third might be, and probably something Gigi and I would probably agree on, a huge part of it was also built on the continued protection of the long-term viability of the broadcast model as an inherent public trust, a public social compact that the country remain deeply committed to. We could debate that pro or con, but at the time that judgment was made, over-the-air viewership was still close to 70% of the American population. That number today, relying completely on over-the-air video distribution, is only 14%. So you could debate what you think the rule should be, but what you can't do is continue to defend a rule solely on the basis of its original purpose and conception when those factual predicates and those market rationales are no longer authentic and viable. So what you get is a regulatory structure that at best is faded and ambiguous, and what it leads to, as my opinion is, it's fertile for regulatory mischief. I happen to, willing to entertain the question that Gigi posed, for example, about Sky, Angel, and MVPD, but are you talking about all the burdens or just the benefits? Frankly, more often than not, people attempt to take advantage of provisions that will handicap a competitor, advance the entry of their offering, or provide them competitive advantages, but not with the full panoply of things that Congress carefully balanced in making a trade-off when at the time that it made those judgments, this was the only creature it had available for its evaluation. And so it's all well and good to say, well, I'm not sure everything should apply to them, but the rule is premised on a very careful balancing of both your position, your responsibilities, your investment needs, and the benefits you enjoy. And to pull like a pixie stick out of the regulatory structure and enjoy only its fruits and none of its pains, I think creates a very disruptive, conflicting, and not logically applicable regulatory framework. And I kind of think that's fundamentally what we're living with today. My only caution when you say, well, what should we do about it, is just because you know it's broken doesn't mean you always are clear about what the fix is. I mean, rules can either be ambiguous, faded, and no longer effectual, and that they're not necessarily particularly burdens. They're not burdens or benefits. They just sort of hang there, you know, like warts that won't go away, but they're not fundamentally distorting or distracting anybody for doing anything. But any modern evaluation of the video market has to take into consideration the massive transformation on what people watch, when they watch it, and how they watch it. You know, if everybody's going to quote Yogi Bear, you observe a lot by what you watch. Well, they're watching a lot of high-quality TVs over a myriad of platforms that have never been heard of before. You know, my wife is really mad at me right now because when she comes home, she just wants to watch her show. The problem is there's 19 different ways to watch your show, and she can't figure out whether we're turning the input to the Apple TV, the Roku, the Hulu, the smart Samsung TV, or we're watching it linearly over cable, we recorded it on our DVR, or we're going to watch it on demand. She doesn't care. We can't confuse the technology with what consumers do with 8.5 hours of every day. They watch programming and stories that move them. And as that market fragments across multiple platforms in multiple ways, that shouldn't be forgotten. And a model that continues to feed that appetite, a marketplace where programming costs between $4 and $5 million per episode, is an awful expensive programming environment, a high degree of quality that we're all heralding, having won cable 9 out of the last 10 Golden Globe Awards. They're very proud of that, but that comes at a massive expense. And so as we consider what we do next, if you want to continue to feed the consumer passion in America around video and high-quality stories, you're also going to have to make sure you do it in a way that preserves a monetization model that'll make those productions continue to be viable. I still think that future is bold, optimistic, and innovative. Excited to be in it, and look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
So Stacy is one of those old disruptors. Let's hear from you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you to Free State Foundation for inviting me to talk with you this morning. Before DIRECTV launched service in 1994, there was no such thing as video competition. If you wanted a multi-channel video service, you got from your cable operator or not at all. Now today, DIRECTV is now the second largest MVPD. We face competition not only from cable, but from Dish, Verizon, AT&T, and now over-the-top providers like Netflix and Hulu. And this increased competition is mainly good for consumers. You get more choice, it forces competitors to improve their service. But this competition has also now created an imbalance between distributors and programmers. Programmers have always had a monopoly over their product, but now they can play one distributor off of another. This is actually the only market that I've ever seen where there's actually more competition has led to higher prices. And you can see this results in the imbalance everywhere in the video space. It's in rising sports costs, such as ESPN paying the NFL over $15 billion in 2011 for Monday Night Football, forced bundling, program bundling, such as the circumstances that led to the Viacom Cablevision lawsuit, and packaging requirements that limit consumer choice and force subscribers to pay for channels that they don't want. You can perhaps see this most clearly with respect to broadcasting programming, as everyone has mentioned, with spiraling retrans consent fees and costs and numerous blackouts. In 2012, there was over blackouts in almost 100 different markets across the country. Broadcast programming presents the most particular problems because it isn't a true market. The market for broadcasting programming is subject to numerous regulations that protect broadcasters and promote free over-the-air television service. And in 1992, when cable was the only MVPD, Congress created the must-carry and the retransmission consent rules. And these essentially give local broadcast stations a government-mandated geographic monopoly over network content and guaranteed distribution even for the least watched stations and even in areas where their broadcast channel doesn't actually reach. And for a long time, this actually worked well, and that's because you had broadcasters being a monopoly on one side of the table, and you had cable being a monopoly on the other side of the table, and you kind of basically a balance of terror. No broadcaster wanted to lose all their eyeballs in the cable franchise area, and no cable operator wanted to lose a broadcast network. So ultimately, these two parties were able to reach a deal, and blackouts were almost unheard of. But things have changed, but the government rules still give the broadcaster its monopoly. Now, however, the broadcaster sits across the table from multiple competitors, each of whom are fighting for subscribers. So what happens when one side has leverage and the other side doesn't? Prices go up, and the stations are coming down. And as paid TV competition increases, the situation only gets worse. Now, broadcasting is definitely a special case, but I think the imbalance of power also applies to cable programming as well. Today, cable programmers use their leverage to require distributors to accept bundles and packaging commitments they wouldn't otherwise accept. And this, in turn, makes consumers pay more for programming that they wouldn't necessarily want to watch. So where does this leave us? I think it's time for the government to take a fresh look at a video marketplace today and see how it really affects consumers. Maybe it's time to remove regulations that were put in place 20 years ago when the world looked far different than it does today. Or maybe it's time to look at new regulations in order to protect consumers. So I wouldn't profess at this point to know all the answers, but I think it's very least it's time to start the debate and to look at it with a realization of what the marketplace looks like today. Thank you.
Thanks, Stacy. Stephen?
Thank you, Debbie. Happy to be here today, and I know Randy is very focused on keeping us on track. So my suggestion that we have this great new space is that next year we have a little orchestra and we can pretend we're at the Academy Awards, and when people start to go over their time, the music can cue up. I think that might be a nicer way to move everybody along. And speaking of sort of time, I'm tempted to cede my time back because a lot of the points that I wanted to make have been made quite eloquently by some of the other folks on the panel already. The 3 points I was hoping to make today was that in order to get the regulatory approach right going forward, we need to have a dialogue and a common understanding of what's wrong with the current approach. That was point one. The second point was to talk a little bit about retransmission consent as the poster child for what happens when you get it wrong and what kind of harm can be caused. And then finally, a few thoughts on what's a better way or a better approach and how do you get there. So I will take each of those in turn, because if I succeed my time, I think Randy will not give me my very large speaker fee that he promised, and I'm counting on that. So the first, what's wrong with the current system, and I won't go into very much detail since Michael really talked about that the 92 Act and a lot of the FCC rules and regulations that both flowed from that and have since followed are really premised on the notion that cable is a monopoly provider. And whatever the situation was in 1992, is the reason Stacy outlined, it just absolutely isn't the case today. There's more programming options. And consumers have an increasing ability to watch what they want, when they want it, and on a whole variety of devices. Gigi sort of suggested that we're still using these same devices, and I don't think that's actually true either. Time Warner Cable, for example, just announced a deal with Roku where you can get our linear cable service on a Roku box. You can watch program on your iPad. There's lots of different options that are now emerging in the marketplace. So clearly the marketplace has changed dramatically, and the rules haven't. And again, sort of to play off a comment that Michael made about, does that matter? Well, in some cases, maybe it doesn't. It's just a little bit of annoyance. But there are real harms in other cases. For example, retrans. As a number of people have talked about already, the government has inserted itself into the relationship between MVPDs, or visually cable operators, and broadcasters in a circumstance that no longer exists. So now those rules have caused significant blackouts and price increases or rate increases of retrans fees that get ultimately passed on to consumers. And both the rates and the blackouts cause real consumer harm. And that has really been a result of the mismatch between monopoly-based rules and a more competitive environment. So finally, what do we do about all this, and where do we go from here? And I think there has to be a recognition in the policy community that abandons the cable as a monopoly mindset, and any review or assessment of existing regulations and any new regulations going forward has to take into account the competitive landscape that currently exists. So the long-term solution clearly is to a comprehensive rewrite of these rules, but that seems, for a variety of political and practical considerations, unlikely. But there is an opportunity, a real opportunity, to look at more targeted reforms, and retrans certainly the first one among them. And then one of the things Commissioner Pai talked about, if Congress gave the FCC more tools, specifically forbearance for video service, that would be a way to address on a case-by-case basis some of the most egregious problems. There were a number of hearings in the second half of 2012 where Congress really looked at the video marketplace, and I think a lot of the themes that we've talked about today came out, and I am hopeful and ever optimistic that mindset will carry the day, and that will be ultimately reflected in how policymakers approach video regulation. Thank you.
Bill?
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and what everyone said about Rob McDowell, he's a prince. Would you like to step back and look at a little bit of the evolutions that are going on with respect to video? There's a lot of talk these days in Washington about the evolution of voice service to IP, but there's a parallel evolution, not quite as far advanced perhaps, of cable service from analog to digital and then ultimately to IP. It's clear that in the future, video service, even provided by the MVPDs, will be an application writing on an IP platform. We're already thinking about what are the implications of that evolution for regulation of the service providers and for the treatment of the devices at the end of the network. a simultaneous evolution is going on with respect to the handling of content. There is what someone recently called a steady drip, drip, drip of video content onto the internet. It's very much in its beginnings. I think the program providers realize that they still make most of their revenue from traditional TV distributors. As long as that's the principal business model, I think that will limit the availability of video on the internet, but that's a business evolution, and we see it occurring. But at the same time, there's roughly 30% of the homes in the country that don't have broadband. So when we look at the regulatory implications of video over the internet, we have to realize that those implications so far haven't reached a significant part of our population. Is it ready? Is it time now for a comprehensive rewrite of the Act? I think that's obviously for Congress. We live to serve, and we'll do what we're told. But we know that it's not too early for us to be considering experiments with regulatory innovation to reflect the changing marketplace. And I'd just like to mention one example of that. The Commission recently decided not to extend the prohibition, the per se rule prohibiting exclusives with respect to content of vertically integrated cable companies. What we did instead was to move to a case-by-case approach bolstered by presumptions. For example, a presumption that a regional sports network is must-have programming. And the reason for trying to insert presumptions is that a case-by-case approach without some presumptions or rules to guide it can be very resource-intensive. And our thought was that rather than have a per se, if we could have a case-by-case approach but guide it with presumptions of that sort, we might be able to accommodate these developments and possibly develop a model that we could use in other contexts. So I think this is just one example of the fact that the Commission, I think, under existing law, has the ability and I think the willingness to try to adjust our regulation to changing circumstances, and we'll continue to do that, unless and until Congress gives us a different regime to administer.
Thanks, Bill. That was very visionary, actually, and I loved hearing all that from you. And the presumptions, terrific idea and case by case, but we're still living in this Byzantine world that Gigi reminded us of. And so I guess if we are looking toward the possibility of either a new Communications Act, a new Digital Act, or just even some new legislation, maybe you all could kind of briefly talk about that in terms of, are there any vehicles? I guess last Congress we saw the Next Generation TV Marketplace Act, and then also the Freedom for Consumer Choice Act. So do you think that there is any vehicle, or do you all see anything coming down the pike? If not, if you had a blank sheet of paper, then maybe you can give us one or two ideas of what the scope of regulatory oversight might look like. Donna.
I'm not sure what the vehicle is, but I know that there are certain characteristics that whatever the vehicle is must have. And I think it is obviously many of the things that have been mentioned by the panel, taking into account the enormous change in the marketplace, in the competitive landscape, in the technology that's available now, and all of the new services coming out. So any proceeding or vehicle that is under consideration should definitely have that as one of its things that it sets its attention upon. And I think also to keep in mind that some of the maybe flaws of some of the regulatory approaches in the past, just to remember and to think carefully and maybe use a little bit lighter touch. I'm very much in favor of some of the ideas of test beds and trying new things before something is necessarily written in stone, but I think just keeping all of those things in mind are essential.
And I guess I might ask you just to comment on Commissioner Pai's idea about applying forbearance in the video market.
So in the words of Stanley Kowalski, Stella! Okay, that's the vehicle That's the satellite, I don't even know what it stands for anymore, but it's the renewal of the compulsory license. for
Satellite Television Extension and Localism Act.
Thank you. So that's the sort of must-pass or kind of must-pass vehicle, although in the past, they've kept it clean. I don't think they're going to lord it down. I did mention this arbitration bill that I'm not even sure who's actually on the Hill. My people tell me that it's buzzing around. I think, I think the best vehicle particularly for some retrans reform is the FCC. And unfortunately, they construe their authority way too narrowly. So I think that's the way to go. It would be nice if Congress gave them more authority to do things like standstills for blackouts and arbitration. But we've made this argument. I'm not going to go through it now. We've made this argument in our filings. We think they've got the authority now, and they certainly can repeal the Syndex and all, the distant signal provisions and the blackout provision. Those are their rules. That's not a congressional thing. They could do that tomorrow if they had the courage.
Michael?
I would just give you other things to watch. Stella, certainly, I think the most principal thing to focus on. I'm relatively sure someone will likely think about introducing another comprehensive act, not unlike what Scalise and DeMint were. The chances of passage of something of that comprehensive nature, I think, is highly unlikely, but it's certainly a floating vehicle. I would also watch FCC process reform, which seems to always continue. So, for example, if you're talking about something like forbearance, there's an argument that that can be in the context of something that is process-oriented around reform as much as it is substantive about video, so that's certainly a vehicle. And then what I would really say is watch for exogenous shocks. One might be the Aereo case. If that case comes out one way or comes out another way, it could create an enormous amount of immediate energy around a concern that could force Congress into action. I still believe elements of net neutrality, because of over-the-top video, could conceivably draw in questions about video, at least in the context of internet-delivered video. So I think, the Cablevision lawsuit, whatever its merits, that outcome, although it's probably a long way off, given the way litigation goes, but it is one of those exogenous events out there that could suddenly change the landscape, and suddenly people disinterested in legislative action would become intensely interested in legislative action. Again, I think our judgment is right now, we don't see a Congress that doesn't have other priorities and commitments that are going to consume an enormous amount of its time, and a massive rewrite of the Act are probably not in the cards for the next year. But there are very surgical things that I think can be generated from these other viewpoints.
Yeah, I would just, echo a lot of what everyone has said. Stella is kind of a little unique in that, for us especially, it is must-pass legislation to ensure that our distant signal license continues for about 1 million subscribers. So I think that will definitely be a vehicle that there will at least be a lot of conversation around, and especially, as Michael said, if anything happens on any of those court cases between now and then, look for that for a vehicle for whoever's on the losing side of that to try to look for congressional remedies along those lines as well. And as far as, FCC reform, again, we also think that there is discretion that the FCC does have in doing retrans reform and other things, but also, if forbearance authority came down the road, as long as it's well thought out and justified, it would be a nice option to see where Congress can act quite as quickly to keep up with the marketplace to give the FCC authority to do so.
And, predicting what's going to happen in Congress is a fool's errand, but I think any of these issues where, Stella hearings or a comprehensive bill that gets introduced or conferences like this are of real value in having a dialogue about what the marketplace looks like today and why the monopoly era mindset needs to be jettisoned. And I think over the next sort of year or so, the real mission is going to be sort of winning the hearts and minds of people to recognize how competitive the video marketplace really is.
To pick up the theme of process reform and forbearance, there is a variant of forbearance that Congress has tried in the video area, which is to establish sunset provisions with authority for the Commission to consider extension. That's what we used in the case of the exclusives ban with respect to vertically integrated content. We recently decided not to extend our viewability rule, another case in which Congress said after X number of years, take a look and see whether it should be extended, and we decided not to. And of course, we have the authority to do that with other provisions that are simply FCC rules. We recently decided no longer to forbid encryption of basic tier services on cable because market conditions had changed and that rule is no longer necessary. I have to mention retrans since everybody else does. That's a very odd regime of essentially regulated negotiation. Someone has suggested that's sort of an oxymoron, like managed competition. But it's the regime we have. And we have tried to thread that needle. We got a lot of input in response to our notice of proposed rulemaking on that. And the proceeding is not dead. We continue to look at it and to watch events in the marketplace. And if Congress chooses to change that regime, we have concluded and told the Congress that we don't have the ability to, under the current statute, to take some of the remedies such as mandatory arbitration that have been urged on us. Congress obviously could choose to give us that authority, but we'll try to do the best we can under the statute we have.
So, Bill, are you regularly reviewing to see if there are those opportunities, like you've given examples, to see where there are places to reform without congressional approval?
Yes, we think about that constantly, and of course people can bring that to us. The encryption ban was something brought to us, first in the form of requests for waivers, and then we concluded really we shouldn't be waiving this rule. We should think about whether the rule should exist at all, and concluded that it shouldn't.
Great, thank you. Gigi?
Yeah, I just want to add one wild card. Yesterday, the Register of Copyrights testified about her desire to have Congress completely rewrite the copyright law. And that's where Aereo really comes up. And depending on which way the Aereo case goes, and then it could also, there could be an impact if there is some desire in Congress to rewrite the copyright law to clarify what is a public performance. I don't want to get into that. That is the central copyright question in the Aereo case. But if Congress decides to make it easier for companies like Aereo to not run afoul of the copyright laws, then that could have a huge impact as well on the marketplace.
I wanted to ask you all, I think it was Gigi that brought up the devices and what has happened. Obviously, we heard in the last panel about Xbox and, whether or not that should be able to perform 911 functions or whatever. But increasingly, there are all types of features for video, Wi-Fi for tablets, TV everywhere, going to the cloud. But the FCC proposed to regulate video devices more comprehensively with the all-vid notice. So what is the road ahead, I guess, for video devices? And then, Bill, I guess you might just tell us where the all-vid notice is.
You start?
Yeah.
Yes, the all-vid proposal is still out there. We've continued to just watch the developments in the marketplace, and there have been a lot of developments since we made that proposal. I'd like to hope and think that maybe the proposal helped to spur some of those developments. One thing that's happened is that it's clear that whole home solutions are something that consumers want increasingly. They just don't want one box in each room separately, but they want a system in which they can record in this room and watch in that room and so forth. And one thing we did last year was to impose the requirement that boxes have an IP output, with the thought that whatever the status of that first box in the home, we wanted to make sure that there was a retail marketplace for all the other boxes that would be connected to it, and that would be enabled by having an IP output on the first box. Whether that rule survives the EchoStar decision is an open question. We know that our cable card regime took a real hit in that decision, and one of the things we're thinking about is what we do in terms of reinstating some or any of those rules. And we're thinking very much about what will be the replacement for the cable card regime in an IP world. It's not designed for an IP world. I think that the all-vid solution was proposed at a time when we were farther than we are today from an IP world, so we're open for suggestions as to exactly how we ought to treat the whole set-top box issue when cable has gone IP.
Michael, do you or Stephen or Stacy want to talk about the boxes?
Not particularly, but One, they're not 25 years old. I have one in my house that's 3 years old. I have one in another house that's brand new, with amazing new functionalities that Cox debuted at the Consumer Electronics Show. One of the things I think the box debate shows you is how radically innovation can change the fundamental judgments that were made at another time. You know, at the time we worried about retail creating, right, asking the government to invent a market for retail boxes. There was almost an assumption that the only video content that mattered and where you were going to introduce this competitive layer was the multi-channel video content. Well, one of the things that is evolved is that probably the hottest product in the box market are ones that aggregate and collect over-the-top video streams that are separate and distinct from what the cable operator is providing. Roku is making a business. Boxy is making a business. Amazon is making a business. TiVo is making a business. Not Amazon, but TiVo is making a business. They're all those companies we hear about are making businesses by attempting to be an aggregator of a really compelling suite of video programming. And by the way, every leading innovative tech company in America seems interested in chasing this market. There is not hardly anyone to be left out in the pantheon of companies that have announced an intention in the television video distribution space, whether it's Google, Apple, Amazon, Intel, Facebook, Sony, Samsung. The lists are long. They continue to see differentiated opportunities for them to take a place in the value chain. IP is a big shift that's going on. I think to try to jam that into the box architecture thinking of the past would be a mistake. I also think the trend from hardware to software is huge. Time Warner has done a really cool thing with Roku, but it's partly because they increasingly are figuring out how to provide that live linear stream using software design rather than hardware design. And the minute you can use software design and you speak the language of computers in the form of IP, essentially any computing device is potentially your access point. That's the holy grail for consumers, that you don't have to think about your box. You don't have to think about whether you prefer the Galaxy S4, the Apple iPhone 5. It doesn't matter. You're running a software stack that can operate an IP and speak the language of computers, and it can be whatever you want it to be. That, to me, is the holy grail, not creating another thing that CES can show at a show and you can buy. I think it's let the consumer have whatever they want to have and let innovation drive things in that direction.
So I love that idea. I love it. The problem is it is the holy grail. Okay? Consumers should have a choice to be able to connect to their cable system through any device. But right now the system is whatever the cable industry, whatever companies like Roku, the cable industry gives permission to, that's who gets to sell to consumers. So I don't want to belabor this because in the grand scheme of things it's probably a small thing. But my dream is that consumers can go to Best Buy, or they can get online to Amazon, or they go to Gregg or Graffiti Audio, and they can buy whatever device they want to connect to a cable system, and it shouldn't be a permission-based society. So it shouldn't have to be a holy grail, and there is a law, it's called Section 629, that requires competition in navigation devices, and I just think maybe things need to change because we're going more to IP, but I still do not believe the FCC has fulfilled Congress's intent in passing that section of the Communications Act.
Stacy?
Yeah, I'll just add, because we're, being a satellite provider, we have a little different technology, and we will never be the all-IP world. We don't have any head-end on the ground, so basically we use our set-top box as a head-end in the home. And that's not to say we're not innovating, we just actually, our new Genie box has a gateway in the home that could talk to any RView-enabled television, which is an open platform. Samsung has them, other companies are developing, so you don't need the set-top box on every single television set. But in the world that we live in, we don't just transmit plain vanilla programming. And if we were just sending through the channels that you can say any box can do and have that functionality, that's fine. But for us to compete, especially as a standalone video player, we're really competing on our innovative services. We're competing on customer service, we're competing on innovation. And if we don't have a set-top box in the home that has the features that we promise our customers, that includes VOD, it includes NFL Superfan, it includes YouTube searches, then we can't make that commitment to our customers come through. And if there is no way to explain to a customer from DIRECTV that, okay, if you buy this box today from someone else, you know what, all these innovations that we're going to do tomorrow may not work as well in them. And we try to work with multiple manufacturers. We actually have a new TiVo box set out. TiVo actually has an interesting history. When we first had our TiVo HD box, it was MPEG 2. So when we wanted to innovate and move to MPEG 4 and have more, which is greater capacity, more services for folks, anybody that bought a TiVo HD box could no longer get HD service from us. And did they go to TiVo and say, okay, replace my box? No, they came to DIRECTV and said, I want what you're offering. I'm subscribing to DIRECTV. You need to give me a new box. Customer service, another one. I mean, if we're going to solve our problems that our customers call us, they're not going to call the box manufacturer, that we need to have understanding how our architecture works and make sure our services work. So again, we believe in innovation. We think it's happening, and we're forward thinking, and we're trying to get rid of all the boxes in the house. But in order for us to be competitive and to provide customer service and innovation, that we need to have at least that basic gateway be our box.
Stephen, did you want to respond? I don't want to cut you off.
I guess just the final comment, because I don't know that Gigi and I would agree on whether the marketplace is taking care of this issue or not, and I certainly think that it is clearly moving that way. But the one sort of note of caution, I commend the FCC for the approach, which is let things develop and watch, because the risk here is if you are imposing technical standards in an area that's moving as quickly as this is, you're probably going to get it wrong, and that imposes real costs. I mean, we see with the cable card regime now, which the cable industry has spent tens of millions of dollars for something that really is not necessary and was probably a mistake. So we don't want to sort of revisit that, and I think the wait and see approach on all of it is the right one.
Donna, one quick comment.
I wanted to say that I think that these equipment and box issues are one of the hardest things for regulators to deal with in FCC. A lot of it has to come from the industry, but I want to say that I'm glad that I'm not in your shoes anymore, Bill, because I think with the technology moving as quickly as it is and all the different things happening, the government and needs to be careful with moving in with standards and anything hard and fast that would not take advantage of some of the developments that are happening. And I just wish you all the luck in the world, because it's tough.
Can we just run down quickly, because I know we're really needing to close up just in a moment. I, of course, have been writing about tiered billing for a number of years, dating all the way back to '09, I just noticed, and just wondered if you all might run down the line and talk a little bit about, I guess DOJ was investigating pricing practices, metered, tiered, data caps, and so what should the regulatory approach be? Donna.
I'm not a good person to ask, because I'm one of those households that only watches 15 channels, except for all the ESPN ones.
Gigi?
You know, so despite public knowledge's clear distaste for data caps, I'm not quite sure we have the regulatory answer yet. I mean, for sure, you know, I can say unequivocally, we would oppose any use of data caps for discriminatory purposes. So what Comcast is doing with their Xbox service, essentially not applying their Xfinity service to the data cap, but applying everybody else's video service to the data cap to us, is a violation of the open internet rules and should be treated as such. And we have a complaint, actually, not under the open internet rules, but under the terms of Comcast's merger agreement, and which the FCC has now had for at least a year, not even more. I've just stopped counting. So that's number one. Number two, there has to be transparency. That's got to be critical. Now, we do believe that, you know, we're not opposed to price discrimination, which I'm happy to hear that the cable industry has finally come to its senses and admitted that data caps are not about congestion, it's about price discrimination. Our problem with data caps as a price discrimination tool is that consumers can't really read the signals. They don't know what to give up in order not to go over their cap, and they're going to underutilize. We think speed tiers is a much better way for consumers to have price discrimination, for consumers to understand, hey, it's taking me forever to download this movie, or my stream is balky, so therefore I need to go to another tier.
So maybe this is a place to try one of these tiered experiments and see what consumers want, see if they're happy or not, see if speed or price matters.
Yep,
Bill,
love that.
Is that a possibility? Bill A.
Well, I'll jump in. It's happening today. I mean, we think the approach the government should encourage tiered pricing. They should encourage different business models. You know, we got to remember that the internet just really isn't that old. You know, originally everything was metered, then it went to flat rate, and now there's a mix and a range of different pricing options. And the marketplace will continue to change based on what customers want, what works, and what doesn't. We have usage-based plans that, from our perspective, are all about giving customers more choice. So if you want to use less, or you want to pay less and use less, we have an option for that. We also continue to offer an unlimited option for our subscribers. So, you know, let the different companies experiment, and the real concern that we have is some of the dialogue about having the government exclude a particular pricing model we think is really a bad approach.
Never heard that from us.
I can't comment on the specific complaint that's pending against Comcast, but in my view, the marketplace is free to experiment in this area. We'll watch, and if there are particular practices that seem to be nefarious, we may have to consider action. But I think that tiering plans, pricing plans, are something that the market can experiment with, and we'll see what consumers want.
Michael?
So a few things about this, and I'll try to do it quick. One, I really would emphasize we are still in experimental phase. I mean, we have major cable companies who have deployed no tiering or capped models yet. Significant companies like Cablevision, and I always get tired of when we're talked about as some broad brush issue. All of cable is doing this. All of cable is experimenting with many different versions of this, and what Time Warner is doing is very different than what Comcast is doing, and Cablevision's choice not to do it, at least at the time being, is very different than other people's choices to do it. So remember that. I think the second important point that really is unassailable is price variation models are not ever inherently good or inherently bad. They are neutral. They are an accepted pricing model that's used widely throughout the economy, and they're widely accepted. They have benefits and they have disadvantages, and it depends on their application and what the problem you're trying to solve is. I would submit, however, there's 3 or 4 rising problems to which usage or variable pricing models may be beneficial, and I emphasize maybe. The first is this country has an adoption gap. We are persistently stuck with 100 million Americans who have access to broadband but are not subscribing to it. And we can have all kinds of healthy debates why. One of the things that price discrimination often does well is it helps penetrate parts of the market that heretofore have been unwilling to come on the net. The greatest threat to the United States, I think, is more than the silly debates about where we rank in the world. It's whether all of our citizens are online and have universal access to the capability. And if price discrimination can create tiers that are more affordable and more suited to the needs of that 100 million people and get them on the net, that would be a major achievement. That's one thing. The second thing is when the internet started, most of us probably did roughly the same kinds of things. What we're seeing happen as the internet grows and matures is there's a wider variation coming on about the way people use the internet. There are power users who use massive amounts of data and gigabit. There's those who love to cut the cord and do Netflix streaming, and there are still plenty, probably 80% of the mass market of users who do very low bandwidth things. Email, Facebook, Skype, Twitter, these things are not substantial capacity consumption things. So as we get wider variety among the users, you do have a subsidization problem. You have people who are all paying the same price and getting different values of use, and frankly, the power elite user is enjoying the benefits of the subsidy that's being masked by an unlimited pricing model. Not to say that that isn't simple and predictable and you like it for those reasons, but it does mask that cross-subsidization that in other contexts we worry about. I think the third thing is is, and I'm glad Gigi said it, because it's important to just jettison this it's congestion, it's not congestion argument, because we're really not being honest. We're not really talking about congestion. I'll say it over and over and over again. We've been saying it for a while, but it still gets cited as what we're doing. What we're doing is what any company does that has massive fixed costs. Right? We often hear our profitability talked about, well, people ignore completely the cost of building and maintaining the network. The network is a $200 billion expense over the last decade, and it takes $30 billion a year across all broadband providers to keep it going. That thing is digging up the ground, laying in wires, keeping those wires current. You have to sink that money in the ground before you're paid one dime from a subscriber. So the question is, when you go to recover those costs, what's the fairest way to allocate those costs among the people who buy your service? If you have people who use it a little, should they pay the same as the people who use it a lot? Or should you have the people who use it a lot pay more than the people who use it a little? That's what we're really trying to figure out, the fairest way to allocate the cost of a high-fits network. And the last one, I'll try to be quick, that I don't think it's talked about enough is, it is not an infinite resource, whether it's wireless or wireline. You can get congestion. You can get overloading. What we have to do is make sure everybody has incentives to build for efficient broadband use. We have to do it as network engineers. But right now, a lot of apps providers, service providers have absolutely no incentive to design their application or their services in a way that'll use as little bandwidth as required. Why should they? They don't have any cost to really deeply internalize as a consequence of it. It's like when Windows used to write, it could be more and more bloated, and as long as Intel kept making faster processors, it didn't matter. But I assure you, if we go to 100 gigabits or a trillion gigabits, software can bloat to meet that demand if there aren't incentives for efficiency. And if what you're doing is you want that Netflix stream to continue at high capacity, they should also have to be concerned about efficient algorithmic design. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Powell. I wanted to say that it's no surprise to anybody here that the Competitive Enterprise Institute found the FCC to be in the top 3 most expensive agencies with $132 billion in regulatory costs. Public knowledge did call this nonsense. However, I would like to just remind us all that regulations do cost all of us. And with that said, the great and powerful Oz is here. I want you all to join me in thanking this fabulous panel for being here.
Okay, and I want you to join me, the great, powerful Oz. I've never heard that one before, but in thanking my friend Deborah Taylor Tate for moderating this panel so expertly. So let's thank her. Okay, now here's what's going to happen. Just one second. We have a really nice buffet lunch that's outside of those doors immediately to your left, and the buffet is ready. Senator Rubio is going to speak at 1 o'clock. You're going to have to go get, and he's going to lay out his telecommunications priorities for us. And so you're going to have to go through that lunch line, bring your food back here, dig in, and then he'll be with us at 1. Immediately following Senator Rubio's speech, then we're going to have the Spectrum Auctions panel, and then immediately following that, Blair Levin, my friend, is going to deliver some closing remarks. So please help yourself to the buffet line right now.